Can we hear me? Are we good to go? All right. Well, good morning again. Once again, the unique meeting in this kind of setting. Wish I could see all of your faces and to look into all of your eyes. I'll do that with the people here until the point they get uncomfortable. And then I'll look at the camera or something like that. You know, how many times have you noticed that life comes in waves? It never seems to be one thing at a time. Is that just me? Is that just something that happens in my life, or does it happen to you as well? Where it's not one thing, but it's another, and it's another, and it's another, and the waves come crashing in. And if those waves are heavy, if they're waves of heaviness, of anxiety, of depression, of sadness, of pain, of trauma, they beat us down. And we find ourselves, when life becomes so overwhelming, that I just want to, and I'll let you fill in the blank there. Because we all have our own ways of filling in that blank. Life becomes so overwhelming that I just want to die. I just want to drink. I just want to hide. I just want to escape. I just want to run away. I just want to stop the world. I want to get off. And you know, what do we say during those times? It can get to the place where it defies words, where it comes to the place where I don't even have the words for it. And the great thing is, God has not only invited us to speak openly and honestly with Him, but He's given us words to do it with. As if He said, here, try these. Talk this way to me. It's a liturgy. If you go into the more formal, maybe the older, the more classic churches, and there's a very strict liturgy that you follow. And then you say this, and then you kneel down there, and then you stand up there, and now you sing, and now you close your eyes, and now you bow your head. And everybody reads from the same book. Well, God has done exactly that for us in giving us the book of Psalms. You know, there's something about poetry. I've been fascinated by poetry since I was a kid. I grew up in a generation when I'm sorry, I'm distracted by what's going on here. You know, that's the other thing about not having a crowd. If one person's chattering, it's 20% of the audience. So, and that's my apologies, not those who are talking. Okay? But there's something that has fascinated me, and I still don't know at my age now whether I fully understand it, that fascinated me about poetry as a child. I grew up in a generation where it seemed like maybe poetry wasn't very manly. That wasn't the manly way to be. Poetry was for girls. Okay. And so I didn't really explore that fully as a child. I began to appreciate it more as I grew older, as I read more literature. And then I got into seminary, and I had a Hebrew professor that taught me to love the poetry of the Old Testament. And what we have in the poetry of the Old Testament, did you know that 75% approximately of the Old Testament is poetry? We think it's mainly maybe stories. We think it's mainly maybe these prophetic statements, there shall come disaster unto thee. But many of those portions, the stories, the prophecies, are also written in the form of poetry. Something like 75% of the Old Testament is poetry, and it's meant to be read aloud. If you were to live in the ancient world of the Hebrew people of Old Testament times, the ancient world of the Greeks and the Romans, never ever would you find a person sitting there looking at a text and reading it quietly within their own mind. It was unheard of, no pun intended. What you would have noticed was, at the very least, their lips would be moving, someone that was reading, and generally you would be able to hear them articulating the words of what they were reading. And I am a real believer that the scriptures that we have were written in order to be read aloud. Even though our culture has changed, even though our reading style has changed, even though now we read it off of electronic devices instead of parchments or even books, meant to be read aloud. And so will you listen as I read Psalm 77 aloud? You can read along in a Bible or device that you have handy. You can close your eyes and listen. And I'm going to read it as it was written in the Hebrew poetry, with 4 separate stanzas. And so when I finish each stanza, you're going to hear just a bit of a pause. I'll be quiet for a moment. And you think about what you just heard. Maybe grab hold of one of those words or one phrase and run it over in your mind. Psalm 77. I cried out to God for help. I cried out to God to hear me. When I was in distress, I sought the Lord. At night, I stretched out untiring hands, and I would not be comforted. I remembered you, God, and I groaned. I meditated, and my spirit grew faint. You kept my eyes from closing. I was too troubled to speak. I thought about the former days, the years of long ago. I remembered my songs in the night. My heart meditated and my spirit asked, will the Lord reject me forever? Will he never show his favor again? Has his unfailing love vanished forever? Has his promise failed for all time? Has God forgotten to be merciful? Has he in anger withheld his compassion? And then I thought, well, to this will I appeal, the years when the Most High stretched out his right hand. I'll remember the deeds of the Lord. Yes, I will remember your miracles of long ago. I'll consider all your works and meditate on all your mighty deeds. Your ways, God, are holy. What God is as great as our God? You are the God who performs miracles. You display your power among the peoples. With your mighty arm, you redeemed your people, the descendants of Jacob and Joseph. The waters saw you, God. The waters saw you and writhed. The very depths were convulsed. The clouds poured down water. The heavens resounded with thunder, and your arrows flashed back and forth. Your thunder was heard in the whirlwind. Your lightning lit up the world. The earth trembled and quaked. Your path led through the sea, your way through the mighty waters, though your footprints were not seen, and you led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. Last week we talked about living well in times of pain and suffering and trauma. And this week we want to make it just a little bit more specific and say, how do we connect with God in times of pain and suffering and trauma? And here's what we have, I believe, in Psalm 77, set out in this poem through its 4 stanzas, is a pattern for us to connect with God when there is the experience in our lives of pain and suffering and trauma. Notice that from the beginning of the poem to the end, and this is true of all kinds of poetry, there is a movement. Poems are not static. They don't just sit still. They paint pictures for your mind, and they say, walk along with me as we take a walk through this gallery or take a walk through this world and observe what we're seeing. And here's the movement of Psalm 77. The first stanza, the first 3 verses, I believe the theme is angst. We happen to speak English. Angst is a German word. We don't have a word quite like it. You can hear our word anxiety in there. It's something like that, but it's a deep down sense that something is wrong. And the first stanza starts us out in this place where there's angst, there's something wrong. And it's not just on the surface, it's not just a passing situation that I feel is wrong. It feels like all of life, the meaning of life has gone awry. Stanza 2, verses 4 through 9, takes me, takes you, offers to walk with us along with God, moving from angst, the next step, complaint. From angst to complaint. Third stanza, verses 10 through 15, says the next move, the next step along that path, angst to complaint to surrender. Only in step 4, the final verses, verses 16 through 20, do we move into the place, the step, the movement that I would call an encounter with God. Okay? Notice how it goes. Angst, complaint, surrender, encounter. Once again, we especially in the relatively well-to-do Western world, have forgotten how to live well with suffering and pain and trauma. We have developed many ways to get rid of those things, but we've not learned to live with them. And often when we set foot into the church, we forget as Christian people that it takes a journey to encounter God. We don't immediately enter into encounter, but as Psalm 77 so clearly teaches us, captured in one place, in order to encounter God, there are steps that precede it. This, by the way, would make a perfect outline for the book of Job. Angst, complaint, surrender, encounter. This would make a perfect outline of the story of the cross. Angst, complaint, surrender, encounter. And this is the story of our lives in the movement that God with his liturgy invites us into. So let's spend a few minutes with each of these stanzas. You see, angst requires in the first stanza that I am willing to pour out my frustration to God. We have a God that invites us to vent. All the other so-called gods say, look, keep quiet, don't talk to me that way. I demand you stand up straight, you brush your teeth and comb your hair. Don't come here. If you've got problems, go somewhere else. And our God says, no, I want you to pour out your frustration with me. In fact, that is the beginning of the journey of really meeting me. I would contend there are certain ways in which we do not yet fully know God if we haven't learned to vent with him. Verse 1 is the perfect example of this. Just listen to the frustration and the angst. I'm going to try to give it to you literally as the Hebrew poem has it. It doesn't sound like good English, but here's the way the Hebrew poetry reads here. My voice to God, and I cry my voice to God. Okay? It's almost inarticulate. It's not all put together. It's not all polished. You know, as a clinical counselor, I sit in my counseling room. Well, I used to sit in my counseling office. Now I sit in front of a video screen, and someone sits on the other side, and they've come to me, and we're working on those challenges of life. And repeatedly, people feel compelled to say, I'm sorry, I'm just venting. And guess what my answer is as a clinical therapist? Good for you, keep going. You haven't vented enough yet. And if a counselor can do that and listen to that, then how much more our God? Frankly, who else would we vent to? Who else can do anything about it? Okay? I can go home and vent to my wife about what's troubling me these days, and thank God she's accepting of that, and she'll give me a big hug, and she can't do anything about it. God can do something about it. Who else would we vent to? But what you need to feel is in stanza 1, in step 1, in the angst, there is no solution and no satisfaction in this part. Don't kid yourself. Oh, if I just vent, I'm going to feel better. That's where the error comes in. I mean, listen to this. I stretched out my hands all night long, and my soul refused to be comforted. There was no comfort. No matter how long I vented and cried out, I groaned. In fact, listen to this in verse 3. You want to talk about honesty of this poetry. I remembered you, God, and I groaned. Okay? In fact, the Hebrew poetry is literally this. God, I remember, and I make a noise. Okay? An inarticulate noise. Let me think about God. Ugh. That's what's happening in this first stanza. And God is not distressed by that. And God is not saying, straighten up, get it together, come talk to me. God has given us a liturgy that says, in fact, here's my suggested text for a way to talk to me. And so we move from that place of angst. By the way, I said something similar last week. If you're living life and you feel like I'm stuck in one of these steps, the movement has stopped, and it stopped for clinical reasons, I could say 2 weeks, okay? If it stops for 2 weeks and it's totally stuck, it's time to ask for some help. And there's nothing wrong with that because it's a journey that we all take together, and some of us have callings and gifts to help you with that. Okay. But moving from angst, we move into stanza 2, the complaint. This is where we end up saying, okay, God, you and me are going to have it out here. You and me, God, are going to arm wrestle. Okay. Now, it's a given in advance who's going to win. Go read the story of Jacob wrestling with God all night long, and Jacob is a stubborn guy. He's proven that throughout his lifetime, and all he can do is just keep hanging on to God, and it seems like in the story, no matter how much God tries to shake him off, Jacob just hanging on. He's not winning, but he's hanging on, and he says, I'm not going to let go until you show me who you are. Okay, that's what's happening in the complaint step. In fact, verse 4 says this, the NIV says, you kept my eyes from closing. Now that's bad enough. I'm staying awake all night, and by the way, God, you're not letting me sleep, okay? Now these are poetic pictures, they're painting pictures with words, and so what this says is this, God, you're hanging on to my eyelids. Imagine the hand of God comes down from heaven, grabs hold of your eyelids and props them open. Okay. You, in fact, the you is emphatic here. With the sentence structure, you, underline, bold print, you, God, are gripping my eyelids open. So you and I are going to have it out. This doesn't seem like you, God. This is what is being said here. Look, I thought about how it used to be. We all do that, don't we? Oh, things used to be good. Now, there's a little naivety in there because maybe they weren't as good as you thought they were, but we think about things that were good, and the poet says, look, God, I'm thinking about those old days. I remember I used to sing at night. Things were going well. I was sleeping, and this doesn't seem like you. Have you rejected? Have you forgotten? Have you failed? Have you gotten ticked off with me and you're holding back good things from me because you're angry with me? This doesn't seem like you. But in the complaining step, we need to learn that there are questions that are more worth asking. Okay? I remember, at least when I was in school, ancient history, English classes, they said if you're going to write well, you got to think of the who, what, when, where, why, and how. And that was ingrained in me. And what's the one question we all want to ask God? Why? But it seems like this liturgy and this poetry that God has supervised and preserved to be handed down to us, and his men and women that captured this poetry and wrote it out from the creativity of their hearts, it seems like they have learned to ask their questions differently. That why is the last or the final question. These poets are more interested, or more focused, I should say, on asking, what is going on here? How long will it go on? And when will you come through? Okay. You see, I think that as we read through the entire scriptures, all the stories, all the poems, all the teaching parts, very, very rarely does God answer why. And as best I can understand it now, and I'm sure this will be a lifetime question for me, it's because the why answer is too big for my small and limited mind. If God gave me the answer to why, my head would just explode. So he doesn't say we can't ask him. I'm just saying when it comes to the why, he may choose to say, well, you know what, Mike, I'm not going to answer that for you. But ask me. Ask me about what and how long and when. Okay? Angst, that soul wrenching discomfort in time, in life, in relationships, in circumstances, moving from there into complaint. Having gone from angst to complaint, I can step into surrender. Now, where does my self-centered, worldly, human way of thinking? I want to go, okay, Mike, if you're telling me I got to go from angst to complaint, then I want stanza 3 to be a word that starts with S. I want it to be solution. Okay? I desperately want to go from angst to complaint to solution. But what God is teaching us and the pattern he's laid out, and it's throughout his word, is I go from angst to complaint to surrender. Again, just to give you a taste of this in the poetry, verse 10 in the New International Version says, "Then I thought, to this I will appeal." Now, the word appeal there, it sounds like I'm going to make a request. I'm going to appeal my case. I'm going to go into God's courtroom. But really, the word here is not so much what we think of as appeal. It's more like what we would think of as weakness. Then I thought, my weakness. Okay? That's what the poet is saying. Then I thought, my weakness and the years of the strong hand of the Most High. That's what's going on in the poet's mind. It's this contrast between I have no strength and God has all strength. And when confronted with that, having been in the angst and complaint, I'm ready to open up my hands and let go. Okay? You know, it's funny that even Alcoholics Anonymous figured this out, right? We admitted that we were powerless over alcohol, that our lives had become unmanageable. All right, don't check out right now if you're not an alcoholic. Okay, if you are, welcome. Okay, but you can fill in anything you want there. We admitted that we were powerless over something in my life, and that because of that, my life can get unmanageable. Right? And moving from there, it says, and so we surrendered our will to God. Surrender. In fact, the pattern of all of God's work is this: until I die, I cannot live. We know that because it's true of God's own Son, Jesus. Yes, he had a life, but the powerful new life in our concept of time and space as human beings was not fully realized until he died, laid in that tomb, and was raised up. And God teaches us in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 9, these kinds of things happen to us so we would not rely on ourselves, but on God who raises the dead. See, here's the problem with me, and maybe it's a problem with you. I want the resurrection, but I don't want to die. Well, that's nonsense. Jesus told it with stories. Unless a seed gets buried in the ground and kind of decomposes, right? He uses a poetic description. Unless it goes in the ground and dies, it can't sprout up and live. Surrender. Then and only then do we enter into stage 4. The fourth stanza, the encounter with God. Okay. Stanza 4 begins with a description of the waters, the depths, the sea, and they're responding to God. Here's a little Bible reading tip as you're reading through the Bible this year. I know you're all keeping up day by day. Daniel, you keeping up? Okay. All right. He looked upward and to the left when he said that. What does that mean? No. Okay. As you're reading, here's something to remember. When you see pictures of water in the Bible poetry and the Bible stories, it's going to be really one of two things. It's either going to talk about life, about needing to drink to stay alive in desert places, or it's going to be painting a picture of Sheol, the place of death, the place of chaos, the place where everything falls apart as far as human beings are concerned. And notice this, who is bigger, death or God? The waters saw you, God, and they were convulsed. They writhed. Next time you go down to the beach, okay, you're not merely looking at surf. You are looking at the reality that God is bigger than the realm of death, that his kingdom is greater than that. You are not merely looking at salt water and the effects of gravity upon large bodies of water as the moon's gravity pulls it in this direction and that. You are looking at the reality of God's great power. And notice in verse 19, God walks right on top of it. Okay. This chaos is huge, and where does God walk? Right on. I know it says through, but the idea is through like passing through a road or passing through a forest. He's not swallowed up by it. When Jesus got out of the boat, he didn't slog through the water. He walked on top of it. What do we learn from this? God is leading me. He is leading us. And pain, suffering, and trauma is how he leads. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, Psalm 23, I will fear no evil, for what? You are with me. That famous psalm does not say, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I'm going to be all right because you're going to get me out of the valley on the other side. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I'm okay because that's where you are. And that's where you prepare a table for me. And that's where you feed me in a luxuriant manner. And that's where you guarantee that you are going to allow me to live with you in the house of the Lord forever. I hope that Psalm 77 will begin to change and adjust and reshape our minds when it comes to connecting with God in pain and suffering and trauma. God, may it be so. Amen.
Can't unmute. All right.